My early life, in a nutshell, took place, first of all, outside what is now known as Bulukwane, with my grandmother, my mother's mom. And then at 5, I was sent to join my parents who were living in Durban, where I was born. And that's where I spent my childhood years. That's also where I remember being exposed to activities which went into my formation in terms of a political consciousness. Afterwards, I became a teacher, and it was while I was teaching in Durban that I got involved in political activity and ended up having to leave and go into the external mission of the African National Congress. In a nutshell. I was surprised. I mean, to start with, while it was true that I had heard of Living Legends series, but it's not something I had ever consciously reflected on, never mind associated with myself. So it came as a bit of a surprise. I received the news through the usual way. I get correspondence and communications, messages from the staff who assist me, both here in Luthuli House and, of course, Tembi, who's my PA from the other side. First of all, my grandmother. She was just this ever-present figure, in my early memories. As a person who gave me stability, confidence, a feeling of safety, but a feeling of knowing that I belong and there's somebody I can always go to. Secondly, my parents. When I left to go to join them in Durban, they then became the ever-present figures that were always guiding me, putting the framework around me in terms of values, in terms of guiding lessons and do's and don'ts. And I might say they were strict parents. So they really shaped me in terms of a young person who grows up knowing that there's such a thing as being disciplined, being respectful, being hardworking, and knowing that there are certain expectations, especially of me as the eldest daughter in the family. I kind of had to take responsibility, especially for the younger ones. Remember, we're a family of 8, and I'm the second of the 8, but the eldest girl. Now, being an eldest girl in an African family means there are certain responsibilities you take for the running of the household. So basically, I would suspect that part of what I now realize are some leadership qualities, if one may claim to have any, would have started forming at that point in my life. When you grow up, nobody says there's politics, it's an option, it's something you want to make up your mind whether or not you want to join. Life unfolds. Life happens, and you are there. It's affecting you, it's influencing you without as much as loud speeches about it, but you get formed from that environment. So I would say that it really is with hindsight that you look at things and you realize how things have come all the way from back then in the memories that you would have to where you are. And so, it's only with that exercise of looking back that I'm able to say, oh, okay, when my mom was part of these gatherings of women, this is what was going on, now that I can read and hear about history. So, and of course, you also get toughened by the difficulties that you go through as part of a family that is not particularly rich, where there's a struggle for resources to be spread out for a family of 10, where my parents really had to battle, but managed to make things happen and to bring us up and to bring us to where we are now as adults. In my life, as I've said elsewhere, the activities that stand out most are the activities of the 50s, of the potato boycotts, where the women, and therefore my mother and other women of her generation, were very active and were very militant and were very clearly agitated. And although one didn't quite understand what the issues were, you kind of absorbed that energy. So that's one thing. But the second incident that stands out in my own memories is now fast forward in 1962 with the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe and the explosions and the darkness that fell upon the little town of Alice, where we were as a family, where my father was working at Fort Hare, and 3 houses away from us lived one of the leaders I was to meet later in exile, Comrade Andrew Masondo. And of course, he was arrested among the many that got arrested when, of course, very quickly the ANC was banned, and the announcement of the arrival and the existence of Umkhonto weSizwe happened. My dad lost his job. We had to move. But those incidents, the darkness of that night, literally, is a memory that will always be there. What fulfills me most, I would say, are the activities I was honored by the organization to be deployed into, in particular after coming back to South Africa from exile. For me, my having become the Secretary General of the ANC Women's League was a very life-changing development of my own understanding and my skills at running an organization, managing the affairs that affect not just an organization but people, having to be accountable. So one had lots of lessons during that time. And of course, you also learn how to communicate, and to communicate on behalf of an organization, which also many times might mean it's got nothing to do with your own personal views, but you communicate on behalf of a collective. The second set of lessons that I was to get was when I was then seconded by the ANC Women's League into the negotiations team that were spearheading on behalf of the ANC our input into the constitutional talks, in particular during the World Trade Center phase towards the interim constitution. For me, that became yet another stage of development. In particular, the role that was to be played by that process into the finalization of the constitution making, which was now a process after the first democratic elections. For me, becoming one of the first collective of ANC members to go into the first democratically elected parliament was major in my life. And of course, it wasn't just being in parliament, it was what that parliament was about. As I say, it was about finalizing the constitution. It was also about beginning a process where the very new South African parliament had to be transformed into something that would be in keeping with the new dispensation. So just having participated in that era, in that phase of the building or laying of a basis for a new democratic dispensation, for me, meant a lot. I must say that, of course, then becoming a presiding officer and therefore taking responsibility for leading the institution, for figuring out in more detail a whole range of issues and putting in place rules and so on. Those for me were very, very important exposure, because I could never have thought that running a parliament took what, in fact, I learned it took. Where the best time, in fact, would be between Christmas and New Year, because it's so silent. Most people are gone. You have a skeleton staff, but you then have the possibility, the peace of mind, and the silence within which you would figure out some of the more complex issues that face an institution like a parliament in a society. I guess there's more, but for me, those were some of the main moments that were very, very gratifying. I think some of the major challenges are that our people are impatient, and rightly so, for a better life. And that's what the struggle was always about. Our people are still hungry. They still live under conditions that are far from satisfactory, actually unacceptable. So that's one set of issues. But the other reality I know I've been exposed to is that those issues, much as we have it in our minds that we need to address these issues, and we even have the policies, we've put in place programs, we from time to time do the things that need to be done to allocate the necessary resources where they need to be channeled to address these problems. The pace is not in keeping with the impatience and the depth of seriousness of the issues that continue to confront our people. For me, that's very, very big, but it's also not easy. It's not something you deal with overnight. But of course, I think we could revisit, one, how we are structured, because I suspect we might save a lot of resources in re-looking how we are structured. And therefore, that talks to the question of the size of the bureaucracy of running a state. Again, you can save a lot from that. There might actually be certain activities within government functioning that are, in my view, unnecessary. And you can tell that I'm looking at where we can save resources so that we can redirect them. You'll find that many times you see adverts. We like advertising. A mayor in some place will advertise in a national newspaper. Is that necessary? So I'm just illustrating, making an example of what might look like a small thing, but when you look at the number of mayors and look at the number of adverts, you might ask yourself how much we would save by rethinking that kind of activity within government. So there are a number of small things, or what looks like it's small, just to save resources and therefore rechannel them to where there are the most acute challenges, especially at the local level. So that's where I would focus in re-looking at how we tighten up. Of course, we didn't come here being experts at running a country or running a government. So we are in a place now where we can say these are the lessons, which is something we do on a continuous basis. A good relationship, I would say. I'm not aware that I have bad relationships with people. I think we have relationships of mutual respect. I have relationships in particular with younger comrades where I consciously always have in mind being able to impart, directly or indirectly, a tip or two about things, either at a personal level or in terms of how things happen within the organization or within a particular structure, within politics broadly. The word achievement is not one that I relate to, but I can, as I've said before, say that when I've been asked or tasked to do certain things, it has hit me as somewhat of a surprise that I can be considered. For instance, when I became deputy speaker the first time, I was supposed to speak. Next thing, I just cried. And of course, next thing I was speaker. And so those were steps in my journey, which perhaps you could call achievements. And of course, I had the shock of my life when the president said one day in a meeting that he thought that I had to win in the transition between 2008 and 2009, become deputy president. I really was shocked. And then more recently, I was honored to be asked or to be appointed by the participating heads of states of Africa to be one of the members of the eminent persons panel of the African peer review mechanism. For me, really, now that was just something out of this world. So, talk of achievements, maybe those were. Well, I've been tasked mainly in the area of women's rights and the struggle for women's emancipation from the time I was in the external mission of the ANC. Apart from being in the Department of Information and Publicity and broadcasting on Radio Freedom at the time for a number of years, I then was part of the leadership of the external wing of the women's structure of the ANC. And of course, when I came back, I continued in that sector to this day. And recently I stepped down I handed over, I mustn't say I stepped down, I handed over to another comrade the position or responsibility of being a convener of the Progressive Women's Movement of South Africa. So that was one area. Another sector I have worked in, which is part of me, which will always be me, is in the arts. I'm a person that loves poetry. Sometimes I write what I call poems. I also love singing and wish one day when I'm retired I can join a choir. And in fact, last weekend while I was in Durban, I did a bit of singing at the BETE Center, and I really enjoyed it, and my soul was kind of nurtured. Yeah, so that's another part of me that doesn't show up every day. Some of my poems have been published, but I have never had the time to focus on actually publishing a collection. I once put together a collection while we were in Tanzania many years ago. It has since disintegrated. I put together another one while I was in Parliament called Silver Stripes. It still has not been published. So one of these days I hope to have time. I was addressing a wedding recently in Mpumalanga, where two young people who come from families that have been involved in struggle were getting married. And I said to them, one thing we didn't hear enough of, which in my view it's about time we said it over and over again, is young people must enjoy life. I think we forget that we got engaged in struggle to liberate our country, to ensure that the future is better than the past, to ensure that even though, and this I said to my son, my youngest child, because he's insisting on being involved in politics, but he says he doesn't want to be an elected politician. I've said to him, if you get into politics, remember to keep one of the 7 days for your personal part of your life. Because when we got into struggle, the thought never entered our minds. We simply went on and on and on and on. And basically some people sacrificed their lives, sacrificed family time because of that. And we're not complaining about it. We don't think anyone is to be blamed for it. It was what it was at the time. And I'd like to say to young people, they must remember the struggle was about a better future, and part of a better future is a quality of life of a younger person being better than when we were young people. So I want to leave that to younger people. Well, I still would like to work with young people. I still would like to have more time and energy to work closely with younger people and tap into who they are and help them unlock the creative beings they are. Because I find that the school system, the education system, conditions us to go to school, learn lessons the way they are ordered and so on. And if you fail that, you might have a feeling about yourself that's so negative. And yet perhaps we've missed the point about who you are. And that's where I would like to spend whatever time one still has, because I think, we ought to do that, to perhaps pursue the same values, to still work for the same kind of future that the struggle has always been about, but to do it bearing in mind that there are other angles from which we hardly ever take advantage of the possibilities of engagement between older generation people and younger generations. And I really think that there's a lot we miss out on by just being so rigid in our understanding of education, in our understanding of how to develop a person, a future leader, a future adult and citizen of a country. And hopefully that will still happen.